He didn't kneel in a church. He knelt in the dirt beside a cow that couldn't stand, and he pressed his forehead against her flank and said nothing, because there were no words left. Gabe Callahan had fought mountains, floods, and men with guns. But he had never watched something die slow and not known why. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and come along for the ride. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 did not arrive gentle in the Bitterroot Mountains. It came hard and without mercy, the way most things came to men who tried to carve a life out of Montana rock. The sun climbed fast and stayed high, burning the pasture grass down to brittle yellow straw, cracking the creek beds into dry maps of nowhere. At Broken Ridge Ranch, the heat was not just weather, it was a presence. It sat on the roof of the barn, and on the backs of the cattle, and on the shoulders of the one man who had refused every single season to give up. Gabe Callahan was 35 years old, and he looked every year of it. Not in a broken-down way, but in the way of a man who had been tested by real things. His hands were large and scarred. His jaw always set a little too tight. His dark eyes carrying the kind of quiet that comes from spending too many nights alone with hard thoughts. He stood 6'2" in worn boots, and he moved through the ranch the way the land itself moved, steady, deliberate, like there was no point in rushing, because the work would be there waiting no matter what. He had built Broken Ridge with his father, and buried his father on the east slope, and kept going. That was the whole of his biography if anyone had asked. Nobody asked. By the third week of June, 7 head of cattle had died. Not from the heat, not from thirst. Something else, something Gabe could not name and could not stop. The animals went down one by one, slow at first, then faster. They stopped eating. Their hides grew rough and patchy. They stood apart from the herd with a hollow look in their eyes that Gabe recognized as the look of a thing already leaving. He had spent 3 sleepless nights reading every page of every ranching almanac he owned, cross-referencing symptoms against known diseases, finding nothing that matched cleanly. He had ridden into the nearest town, Harlan's Creek, twice in 1 week, a thing he almost never did, and spoken to the feed merchant, the blacksmith, the old man who ran the general store, and fancied himself an expert on everything. None of them knew what was killing his cattle. All of them looked at him with that carefully neutral expression that meant they had already decided he was finished. On the morning that the 8th animal went down, Gabe stood at the fence line and did not move for a long time. Then he went inside and wrote a letter. He was not a man who believed in matrimonial advertisements. He had seen other ranchers take that road out of desperation, and he had watched it go badly, more often than not. Women arriving who had misrepresented themselves, or who lasted 3 weeks before the isolation drove them back to wherever they'd come from, or who simply could not survive the physical reality of frontier life. He had sworn he would never do it. He had meant that. But a man alone cannot run a ranch and solve a mystery at the same time. He knew his limits even if he didn't like them. He kept the letter short and honest. He described the ranch, its acreage, its elevation, its condition, which he listed as troubled but not beyond saving. He described himself with the same economy. He listed what he needed: a partner. Someone capable. Someone who would not faint at hard work or hard weather. He said nothing about romance. He barely said anything about himself at all. He folded the letter, addressed it to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, and handed it to the postwriter without letting himself think too long about what he'd done. That was 6 weeks ago. The reply had come in 3 one-page, neat handwriting, a name, Eliza Miller, and a list of skills that Gabe had read twice and then set down on the kitchen table and looked at for a while. Veterinary training, practical medicine, knowledge of livestock diseases and treatments. She had apprenticed under a practicing veterinarian in Ohio for 2 years and had spent another year working on a large cattle operation in Indiana before the letter did not explain the before. It simply said she was ready for a different life and that she was not afraid of hard work or hard country. He had written back, "Come, she was arriving today." Gabe stood at the edge of the yard, hat in his hand, squinting down the long dust road that ran from the main trail to the ranch gate. The stagecoach would come from the east through the gap between the two ridges, and he would have maybe 30 seconds of warning from the sound before it appeared. He had cleaned up as best he could, washed, shaved, put on a shirt without holes in both elbows. He felt ridiculous. He felt like a man waiting for a verdict. The sound came first the way it always did. Wheels on hardpan, the rhythmic percussion of hooves, the distant creak of a loaded coach. Then the shape of it materialized through the shimmer of the heat, dark against the pale dust, moving fast. The driver handled the team well. Gabe noticed that before anything else, because he was the kind of man who noticed competence before he noticed much else. The coach slowed and stopped just inside the gate. The driver climbed down, opened the door, and stood back. Eliza Miller stepped out. She was not what he had pictured. He hadn't let himself picture much. He'd learned early that expectation was just disappointment with a head start. But whatever half-formed image had existed in the back of his mind, this woman was not it. She was young, probably mid-20s, with a round face and dark eyes that moved across the ranch in a single sweeping assessment, the way a surveyor's eyes move across land. She was not small, she was solid, full-figured, the kind of woman who took up space without apology. She wore a plain traveling dress that was dusty from the road, and over one shoulder she carried a leather satchel that bulged at the sides and looked heavy. With her other hand, she held a Remington rifle in a manner that suggested she knew what it was for. She looked at the ranch first, then at the cattle in the far pasture, then finally at him. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Not a question." "Miss Miller." He put his hat back on. "How was the road?" "Long." She walked toward him without waiting to be invited, the satchel swinging from her shoulder. Up close, her eyes were sharper than he'd expected. She had a small scar along her jaw, old barely visible, and her hands, when she shifted the rifle to offer one in greeting, were not soft. "I need to see the sick animals before I see anything else." He had been prepared to offer her water, to show her the house, to let her rest from the journey like a reasonable person would need to. He was not prepared for this. "You've been riding since dawn," he said. "And your cattle have been dying for how long?" He looked at her for a moment. 3 weeks. "Then we've already lost enough time." She glanced toward the pasture. "Where are they?" He took her to the sick pen. She walked the fence line first, not going in, just observing. She moved slowly and deliberately, her eyes going over each animal with a focus that Gabe associated with men who'd been doing something a long time, not women who'd just stepped off a stagecoach after a 4-day journey. She crouched at the fence rail and studied the nearest animal, a young steer that had started showing symptoms 2 days ago. She watched the way it breathed. She watched the texture of its hide, the quality of its movement, the position of its head. "When did you first notice?" she asked without looking at him. 3 weeks back. Started with the older animals." "How many have you lost?" 8. She was quiet for a moment. Any contact with outside herds new stock brought in hides, purchased from another operation. The last question landed differently than the others. Gabe felt something shift in his chest, a small, cold thing. "Last month. I bought a set of hides off a trader who came through. Said they were good quality, reasonable price." He paused. "I used them in the barn. Bedding." Eliza stood up and turned to look at him. Her expression was not accusatory. It was something closer to careful. "Do you still have them?" "Some. I need to see them." She looked back at the steer. "Mr. Callahan, I think your cattle have been exposed to a pathogen through contaminated hides. I've seen this before in Indiana. The symptoms match the progressive skin deterioration, the behavioral withdrawal, the mortality rate." She said it plainly without drama, like she was telling him the time. "If I'm right, this is treatable, but we need to act fast, and we need to act correctly, or you'll lose the rest of the herd." Gabe stared at her. In 3 weeks, not one single person, not the feed merchant, not the blacksmith, not the man who fancied himself an expert on everything, had offered him anything beyond a sympathetic shrug. This woman had been on his ranch for 11 minutes, and she had just told him what was wrong. "How do you know?" he asked, Because I paid attention when my teacher showed me, she said. And because I've been reading about outbreaks in the livestock journals for 2 years. This pattern, it's documented. She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. I brought materials, supplies for a chemical dipping treatment. It was heavy to carry, but I thought it might be necessary based on what you described in your letter. She met his eyes directly. I wasn't sure. I hoped I was wrong. I'm not. He didn't say anything for a moment. The heat pressed down on both of them, the sun at its midday worst, the air smelling of dust and dry grass, and the particular weight of a summer that had been cruel longer than it had any right to be. All right, he said finally. Show me what you need. She nodded once, like that settled it, and turned toward the barn. He followed. They worked through the heat of the afternoon in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people focused on the same problem, each doing what they knew how to do. Gabe cleared the contaminated hides from the barn with grim efficiency, piling them away from any contact with the animals. Eliza set up her supplies along the workbench. Chemicals. He didn't recognize tools. He understood the purpose of, but not the application notebooks filled with her own careful handwriting. She explained as she worked, not in the way of someone talking to impress, but in the way of someone who expected her listener to keep up. He kept up. The dipping vat will need to be large enough for the whole animal, she said, measuring something into a tin container. We'll need to construct it. I can tell you the dimensions. I can build it, he said. Good. She wrote something in her notebook without looking up. We'll treat the sick animals first, and then the healthy ones as a precaution. The chemical solution will need to be the right concentration, too weak, and it won't work too strong, and will do more harm than good. How long until we see results? If the diagnosis is right and the treatment is correct, 3 to 5 days for improvement. Maybe 2 weeks before we know the full outcome. She looked up. There are no guarantees, Mr. Callahan. I want you to know that. I'll do everything I know how to do. That's all I can promise. That's more than anyone else has promised me, he said. Something shifted in her expression, brief, controlled, and she turned back to her work. Toward evening, when the light went long and gold across the pasture, Gabe stood at the fence again and watched the sick animals. They were still down, still struggling. But there was something different about the evening, a quality of purpose that had not been there in the morning. As if the ranch itself had noticed that someone had finally shown up who knew what to do. He heard her footsteps behind him and didn't turn around. You should eat something, he said. I can put together a meal. I'm not helpless in the kitchen, she said, coming to stand beside him at the fence. I didn't say you were. A pause. No, you didn't. She looked out at the cattle. You should know I'm not here to be managed, Mr. Callahan. I'm here to work. I have skills that are useful to this situation, and I intend to use them. I don't need to be coddled, and I don't need to be protected. I just need to be allowed to do what I know how to do. He turned to look at her. In the evening light, her face was serious and direct without pretense. She wasn't asking for his approval. She was telling him how things were going to be. I wrote to you because I needed help, he said. I'm not a man who says that easy. I don't intend to waste the help once it's here. She studied him for a moment, the way she had studied the cattle, careful, thorough, looking for something beneath the surface. Whatever she found, she kept to herself. All right, she said. They stood at the fence a while longer, not talking, watching the last of the sun leave the sky. The mountains around them went dark in sequence, ridge by ridge, and the first stars appeared over the eastern peaks, and somewhere in the pasture, one of the cattle lowed a low, mournful sound that carried far in the quiet air. Gabe had been afraid the last 3 weeks in the particular way that practical men are afraid, not with panic, but with the slow, grinding recognition that things were going wrong in a direction he could not control. That fear had not left, but it had changed shape. It was smaller now, or at least it had company. I'll start on the vat frame first thing tomorrow, he said. I'll be up before dawn to check the animals, she said. He nodded. She turned and walked back toward the house. He stayed at the fence a while longer, looking at the cattle, at the mountains, at the wide, dark sky pressing down on all of it. He didn't know yet what kind of woman Eliza Miller was. He didn't know if her diagnosis was right, or if the treatment would hold, or if the ranch could be saved at all. He didn't know what the coming weeks would bring, or what it would mean to share this land, this burden with another person for the first time in years. What he knew was this: for the first time in 3 weeks, he had not eaten dinner alone, with nothing but worry for company. He put his hat on and went inside. The kitchen was already lit. Something was on the stove. The smell of it hit him before he reached the door. Something warm and real. Coffee and cornbread and whatever she had found in his sparse pantry and turned into a meal. He stopped in the doorway. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, still in her traveling dress, the leather satchel set against the wall behind her. She didn't hear him come in over the sound of the fire, and for just a moment he saw her as she was, when she thought no one was looking. Shoulders straight, movements efficient, the set of her jaw indicating a woman who had made peace a long time ago with doing hard things in places where she was not entirely welcome. He stepped inside and pulled out a chair. "Sit down," she said without turning around. "It'll be ready in a few minutes." He sat. Outside, the Montana night was wide and starlit and warm, with the particular warmth of a summer that had been long and unforgiving. Tomorrow, the work would begin in earnest. The vat, the treatments, the fight to reclaim what 3 weeks of slow disaster had taken from the herd. Tomorrow, whatever fragile understanding they had formed at the fence line would be tested by proximity and exhaustion, and the 1,000 small frictions that came with two strangers sharing a life. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was food on the stove and light in the kitchen, and the sound of another person moving through the rooms of a house that had been far too quiet for far too long. Gabe Callahan set his hat on the table and looked at the ceiling and tried not to think about how much he had needed exactly this. He failed at that too, but it didn't matter. Because somewhere across the ranch in the dark sick pen, one of the animals that had been lying still for 2 days struggled to its feet, took a slow and uncertain step, and held its ground. It was a small thing. But in a season of dying, a thing that stood was something close to a miracle. Gabe didn't see it. But Eliza, who had gone back out with her lantern before he even noticed she was gone, stood at the fence and watched the animal find its balance, and said nothing, and allowed herself just briefly, just privately, to feel the sharp, clean edge of hope. She was already at the sick pen when he woke up. Gabe had risen before 5 the way he always did, and the first thing he noticed when he came downstairs was that the back door was standing open, and the lantern he kept on the hook beside it was gone. He pulled on his boots without sitting down, grabbed his hat, and went out into the dark. She was crouched at the fence rail, with the lantern set on the ground beside her, both hands wrapped around the top rail, watching the animals with the focused stillness of someone who had been there a while. She didn't look up when she heard him coming. "The steer that stood last night," she said. "He's still on his feet." Gabe stopped beside her and looked. The young steer was standing near the far edge of the pen, not moving much but upright. His head was low, but he was standing. "That mean what I think it means?" Gabe asked. "It means we're not too late." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. "It also means we need to move faster than I planned. If one is responding to rest and isolation, the others might hold longer than I feared. But we need that vat operational today, Mr. Callahan. Not tomorrow. Today." He had already been planning to say exactly that. "I'll start on the frame after breakfast." "Start on it now," she said. "I'll bring breakfast to the barn." He looked at her. "I'm not being difficult," she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I'm being practical. There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said, and he turned and walked to the barn. He worked fast. He had built stock pens and water troughs and fence lines and every other kind of structure a working ranch required, and the vat frame was not beyond him. It was heavy work, rough lumber and iron bracing. But he understood the load-bearing requirements, and he moved through it with the efficiency of a man who knew his tools and didn't waste motion. Eliza brought cornbread and coffee to the barn doorway, around 6 set it on the saw bench without comment, and went back to the sick pen. He ate between cuts. By mid-morning, the frame was standing. She came to inspect it without being asked. She walked around it once, testing the bracing with both hands, checking the dimensions against something she'd written in her notebook. He watched her do it and said nothing. "It's solid," she said. "I know it is." A beat of silence. "The lining will need to be sealed before we mix the solution. Any gaps and we lose concentration." She ran her hand along the interior joint. "Do you have pine pitch? In the back of the supply shed. Enough? Should be." She straightened. "I'll handle the sealing. You start pulling the remaining contaminated material out of the east barn. Everything that came off that Hyde trader's wagon bedding rope, anything he might have touched, needs to be out of contact with the herd. Already started that yesterday. Finish it today." Her tone was not harsh, but it was not soft either. It was the tone of someone who had learned that the gap between started and finished was where things went wrong. Every hour we leave contaminated material near healthy animals is an hour we're working against ourselves. He didn't argue. He went to the east barn. The work consumed this morning and pushed hard into the afternoon. The heat climbed to its worst by noon, the kind of dry Montana heat that cracked your lips and turned the air above the ground into something that shimmered and lied about distances. Gabe pulled contaminated material and piled it at the far edge of the property, away from water, away from wind direction, away from anything living. He worked without stopping. His shirt was soaked through by the time the sun reached its highest point, and his shoulders ached in the specific way that came from lifting too much for too long, but he kept going because stopping felt like something he couldn't afford. Around 2 in the afternoon, he heard raised voices from the direction of the gate. He set down what he was carrying and walked toward the sound. A man on a black horse was stopped just inside the ranch entrance, and Eliza was standing 10 feet in front of that horse with her arms crossed and her chin level, and every inch of her posture communicating that she had no intention of moving. The man on the horse was wide-shouldered and well-dressed for the territory-tailored jacket, despite the heat hat with a proper brim, the kind of silver watch chain that announced money before the man opened his mouth. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Gabe knew him. Josiah Rutherford, owner of the Sentinel Range operation, 12,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land to the north. A man who had, in the 5 years Gabe had been his nearest neighbor, offered to buy Broken Ridge Ranch exactly 4 times. Each time the price had been fair enough to be insulting. Fair enough that a struggling man might take it, not fair enough to mean Rutherford actually respected what the land was worth. Miss Rutherford was saying, with the elaborate patience of a man who was not accustomed to being told no by anyone, "I have legitimate business with the owner of this property." "And the owner of this property is currently working," Eliza said. "If you'd like to leave a message, I'm happy to pass it along." "I'd prefer to speak with Callahan directly." "Then you're welcome to come back when he's not occupied." Gabe reached the gate. "Rutherford." The man's smile shifted, widened slightly, became something more careful. "Callahan, good to see you." His eyes moved to Eliza with a kind of assessment that Gabe did not like. "I wasn't aware you'd taken on new staff." "I haven't," Gabe said. A pause. Rutherford's smile didn't waver. "I heard you've been having some trouble with the herd. Word travels even out here." He tilted his head. "I wanted to come by personally, offer my condolences. And, if you're open to it, to revisit our previous conversations about the property." "I'm not open to it," Gabe said. "Now, Callahan, I understand pride. But there comes a point where a man has to be practical. We're in the middle of treating the herd," Eliza said, stepping forward slightly, her voice clear and unhurried. "Mr. Callahan has given you his answer. If you have a legal matter that requires his attention, you're welcome to contact him through the appropriate channels. Otherwise, this is a working ranch and we have work to do." Rutherford looked at her for a long moment. Something behind his eyes shifted, something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but was adjacent to both. Then he looked back at Gabe. "Treating the herd," he said, and there was something in his tone, something measured and careful that Gabe's instincts flagged before his conscious mind could name it. "I hope that works out for you." He turned his horse and rode back toward the main road without another word. Gabe watched him go. Beside him, Eliza watched too, and she was quiet for longer than he expected. "You know him well?" she asked finally. "Well enough." "He didn't seem surprised," she said. "About the cattle." Gabe turned to look at her. "What do you mean? Most people, when you mention an animal illness, ask what kind. Ask how many you've lost. Ask if it's spreading." She kept her eyes on the road where Rutherford had disappeared. "He didn't ask a single question. He just said he hoped it worked out." She paused. That's the response of someone who already knows the answers. The cold thing in Gabe's chest was back, larger now. "You think he knew," Gabe said. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should finish the vat and treat the herd and keep our eyes open." She turned away from the gate. "Come on, we're losing daylight." They sealed the vat lining through the hottest part of the afternoon, working side by side in the barn, with the pitch and the brushes, not talking much. Gabe found himself noticing things he hadn't expected to notice, the way she worked without hesitation. The steadiness of her hands, the small frown of concentration she wore when she was measuring or calculating, the way she never asked for help with the heavy materials, but also never pretended they weren't heavy. She was honest about effort in a way that most people weren't. She didn't perform strength, she just used it. "How did you end up in veterinary work?" he asked somewhere in the middle of the third coat of pitch. She didn't answer immediately. He'd noticed she took her time with personal questions, not evasively but thoughtfully, like she considered what was worth saying. "My father kept livestock," she said at last. "We had a farm in Ohio. When I was 12, we had a sickness move through the pigs, similar kind of thing to what's happening here. Pathogen-based, spreading fast. We lost almost everything." She worked the brush into a corner joint. "A veterinarian came out from the county and saved what was left. I followed him around for 3 days asking questions until he finally said he'd teach me something if I'd stop interrupting." A brief dry note in her voice that might have been the edge of a smile. "I didn't stop interrupting, but he taught me anyway." "Your father must have been proud," Gabe said. The silence that followed was a different quality than the others. "My father thought it was a waste of time for a girl to study animal medicine," she said evenly. "He thought I should learn to cook better and worry less about things that weren't my business." She paused. "He wasn't a bad man, just a man of his time." Gabe didn't say anything to that. He kept working. "I left Ohio when I was 19, she continued after a while. "Found the veterinarian who'd helped us. He'd moved his practice to Columbus. I showed up at his door and told him I wanted to learn. Properly. He told me women didn't study veterinary medicine. I told him I knew that, and I was asking to learn anyway." A beat. "He said no 4 times before he said yes." "What changed his mind?" "I fixed his neighbor's horse," she said simply. "The horse had been lame for 3 months, and no one could figure out why. I looked at it for 20 minutes and told them it was an abscess in the rear left hoof. They thought I was out of my mind. I wasn't." Gabe set down his brush and looked at her directly. "You're not a woman who gives up easy." She met his eyes. "No," she said. "I'm not." Something passed between them, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that required naming. Just a recognition. 2 people seeing each other more clearly than they had the day before. Then she turned back to the pitchwork, and he picked up his brush, and they finished the sealing in the last of the afternoon light. The mixing of the chemical solution was the most precise work Eliza had done since arriving, and Gabe stood back and let her do it without offering help she hadn't asked for. He watched her move through the steps with the careful focus of someone who understood that the margin for error was narrow. She measured twice. She checked her notebook 3 times. When she finally indicated she was satisfied, she set down the measuring tin and let out a breath. "It's ready," she said. "We'll begin treatment first thing tomorrow morning. Sickest animals first." "How many can we treat in a day?" "6 if we're efficient, maybe 8. She looked at him. "I'm going to need your help. It's a 2-person process, one to manage the animal, one to work the dip. The animal needs to be fully submerged briefly and then kept calm while the solution does its work. "I've handled cattle longer than I can remember," he said. "I can keep them calm." She nodded. "I believe that." It was a small thing to say, but it landed differently than small things usually did. That evening they ate at the kitchen table again, and this time the silence between them was not the wary silence of strangers assessing each other. It was something easier. Not comfortable exactly, not yet, but no longer armed. "Can I ask you something?" Gabe said. She set down her coffee cup. "You can ask. Why did you answer the advertisement?" He watched her face. "With your skills, you could have found work at any number of operations. You could have set up a practice somewhere. Why a matrimonial agency? Why a ranch in Montana you'd never seen?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought she might decline to answer. "Because I had tried the other things," she said at last. "I had tried to set up a practice, 3 times in 3 different towns, and every time the resistance was the same. People wouldn't trust a woman's judgment on their animals. They'd listen, nod, and then go find a man to tell them the same thing I'd already said." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I wasn't looking for a husband, Mr. Callahan. I was looking for a situation where my skills would be judged by what I could do, rather than by who I was." She met his eyes across the table. "Your letter said you needed capable help and you described real problems. That was more honest than anything I'd encountered in a long time." He sat with that for a moment. "That's a lot of trust to put in a letter," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. He didn't have an answer to that. He didn't think she was looking for one. He was washing up from dinner when he heard the sound. At first he thought it was an animal, something moving wrong in the night, the sound cattle made when they were distressed. But it was coming from the wrong direction. It was coming from the road. He went to the window. 2 riders, moving slow without lanterns, keeping close to the fence line on the north edge of the property. They weren't Rutherford men that he recognized, or at least he couldn't make them out clearly in the dark. But they weren't innocent travelers either. Nobody rode a fence line at this hour without a purpose. He stepped back from the window. Eliza. She appeared in the doorway from the back room, still dressed. She had been reviewing her notebooks. She took one look at his face and stopped asking questions. "Get your rifle," he said quietly. She turned and came back with the Remington in under 30 seconds. She held it with the same plain confidence. She held everything like it was a tool, and she knew what it was for, and she was ready to use it if the situation required. They stood in the dark of the kitchen, not speaking, listening. The riders passed the north fence line and kept going. They did not stop. They did not double back. After 5 minutes, the sound of hooves faded and the night went quiet again. Gabe didn't move from the window for another 10 minutes. "They were looking at the vat," Eliza said from behind him. Her voice was steady but lower than usual. He turned. "What?" When they passed the gap in the fence line, the section where you can see into the barn from the road, they slowed down. She hadn't been at the window with him. She had been watching from the side. "They were looking at what's in the barn. They know we're treating the herd." He stared at her. "Rutherford," he said. "I don't know that," she said carefully. "But somebody sent those men to look. And the only person who knew we were treating the herd today is the man who rode up to that gate this afternoon and didn't ask a single question about a disease he should have known nothing about." She held the rifle at her side. "Whatever is happening to your cattle, Mr. Callahan, I don't think it's an accident." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, and the rings they made spread far. Gabe had been fighting a dying ranch for 3 weeks. He had been fighting weather and loss, and the slow grinding fear that he was watching everything he'd built come apart thread by thread. He had told himself it was bad luck and bad timing, and the hard reality of frontier life. He had not let himself think it might be something worse. "If you're right," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "then the evidence is critical. Anything that proves what was in those hides. Anything that ties the contamination to a source." "I know," she said. "That's why I kept samples." She met his eyes. From the first day, I took samples of the tissue from the animals I examined, and I kept them sealed in my kit. If this comes to a legal matter, we'll need documentation. A pause. I wasn't sure I'd need it, but I wasn't sure I wouldn't. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had arrived 11 hours ago, with a leather satchel and a rifle, and a diagnosis he hadn't expected, and a habit of thinking 3 steps ahead of the moment she was standing in. You came prepared for more than a sick herd, he said. I came prepared for whatever I found, she said simply. That's the only way I know how to travel. Outside, the Montana night was deep and still, and the stars were very bright, and somewhere in the dark barn, the sealed vat held the solution that might save what was left of the Broken Ridge herd. And inside the kitchen of a house that had been too quiet for years, a man and a woman stood in the dark with rifles and samples, and the beginning of a suspicion that was about to change everything. The cattle were not the whole problem. They never had been. And tomorrow, when the treatment began and the stakes became real and visible, whoever had sent those riders would know that Broken Ridge was not finished yet and that it would not go quietly. Gabe set his hat on the hook by the door. Get some sleep, he said. We start before dawn. I know, she said, and she was already moving toward her room rifle in hand, notebook tucked under her arm, the same way she moved through everything. Like the work was the point, and she intended to do it right. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time after her door closed, listening to the night, cataloging what he knew and what he didn't, adding up the weight of what the next days might bring. Then he went to the window and looked out at the barn, at the dark road, at the long fence line running north toward Rutherford's land. The anger was there. He let it be there. But he did not let it move faster than the thinking. Not yet. They started before the sun came up. Gabe had the first animal haltered and moving toward the vat by the time the eastern ridge showed its first gray line. He worked the lead rope with both hands, keeping his voice low and steady, the way his father had taught him, not commanding, not pleading, just present. A consistent sound for the animal to follow when everything else felt wrong. The steer was weak but cooperative, too exhausted to fight, and that made Gabe's chest tighten in a way he didn't show. Eliza was already at the vat. She had rechecked the solution concentration twice before he'd brought the first animal over. He'd watched her do it through the barn door, measuring, consulting her notebook, measuring again. She didn't look up when he approached with the steer. Hold him at the rail, she said. Let him smell the edge before we ask him to go in. Animals panic less if you give them a moment to understand what's happening. I know, he said. I know you know, she said without heat. I'm saying it out loud because I need us to move in the same rhythm. This part has to be coordinated, or we'll lose control of the animal and potentially contaminate the solution. He nodded and held the steer at the edge. Eliza moved to the far side of the vat, positioning herself where the animal would see her on exit. She spoke quietly, not to Gabe, to the steer. A low, unhurried sound. The steer went in. It was not graceful, and it was not easy. The animal lurched and pulled back twice, and Gabe held the line with every ounce of leverage he had, his boots finding purchase in the packed earth, his shoulders burning. Eliza talked the animal through it from the other side, calm and continuous, and when the steer finally committed and submerged and came up on the far side, she was there with a lead rope of her own, guiding it out before it could panic. They stood on opposite sides of a dripping, confused animal, both breathing hard. 1, she said. 5 to go, he said. She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before she turned back to check the solution level. They treated 6 animals that first morning. By the time the sun was fully up and the heat was beginning its daily punishment, they had moved through each one with increasing efficiency, their timing improving with each pass, their communication tightening from words to gestures. 2, by the 6th animal, nothing more than a look that transferred the necessary information. Gabe noticed it and didn't remark on it. Some things were better left unremarked. When they finished, Eliza made notes in her book while he refilled the water trough for the treated animals. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then she said, without looking up from the notebook, "The second steer, the one that went in sideways. Did you notice the patch on his left flank? He had noticed. Looks different than the others. It is different. The lesion pattern is more aggressive in that area. It suggests the hide contact was direct, not secondary exposure. She wrote something. Which means the contaminated hides weren't just used as bedding. Something was in contact with the animals in a more deliberate way. She paused. Or the contamination was introduced in multiple stages. Gabe set down the water bucket. Say what you mean, Eliza. She looked up then, and he saw that she had already set it in her way, and she was watching him to see if he'd follow. I mean that this doesn't look entirely like an accident, she said quietly. A natural contamination event usually presents more uniformly. What I'm seeing in that steer suggests the infected material was placed where it would have maximum contact. She closed the notebook. I could be wrong. I want to be wrong. But the sample I took from that flank lesion is going into its own separate container today. He stood with that information for a moment. Then, I need to ride into Harlan's Creek. Why? Because if Rutherford is behind this, if this is deliberate sabotage, then someone in that town knows something. Rutherford doesn't operate quietly. He has people. He has arrangements. Gabe picked up his hat from the fence rail. And there's a man in town, Walt Briggs runs the telegraph office, who has hated Rutherford since the man tried to claim water rights on the creek that runs through Walt's property. Walt notices things. Walt talks to people. Eliza was quiet for a moment. How long will you be gone? 4 hours, maybe 5. She looked at the treated animals, then at the healthy pen, then at the barn. He could see her calculating. Go, she said. I can manage the afternoon checks. But Gabe... It was the first time she had used his given name. She didn't seem to notice she'd done it. Be careful what you say and to whom. If Rutherford has people in that town asking direct questions, we'll get back to him before you reach the ranch road. I know how to talk around a thing, he said. I know you do, she said. And she turned back to her work. He rode hard and reached Harlan's Creek before 10. The town was not large, and it was not prosperous, but it was alive in the way of frontier towns, perpetually in motion, perpetually suspicious of anything new, thrumming with the particular energy of people who had very little and were working constantly to keep it. Gabe hitched his horse outside the general store and walked to the telegraph office without making eye contact with anyone, which was his normal mode of moving through Harlan's Creek, and which no one found unusual. Walt Briggs was behind his counter as always, fussing with a key mechanism that had probably been giving him trouble for a year. He was a small, wiry man in his late 50s, with quick eyes, and the listening posture of someone who had spent 30 years intercepting other people's communications. Callahan, Walt said without looking up. Heard you've been having trouble. Some, Gabe said. Some. Walt set down his tool. Word is, you've lost near a dozen head. Word moves fast. Always does when Rutherford's interested. Walt looked at him directly now, and his expression was careful, but not neutral. He's been asking around, about your operation, about the mortgage situation, about whether you've got the capital to weather a bad season. Gabe felt the cold thing in his chest solidify into something sharper. When did he start asking? Walt tilted his head. 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. 6 weeks ago. Before Gabe had written the letter, before the first cattle died, he kept his face even. Rutherford buy any hides recently, new stock material from outside the territory. Walt's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspiciously, but with the look of a man following a trail someone else had just laid down. There was a trader came through about 2 months back, had a wagon full of hides from down south. Most of the ranchers didn't want them, quality wasn't right, something off about them. Rutherford bought the lot. A pause. And then a week or 2 later, I heard a trader came out to your place. Gabe said nothing. Walt leaned on the counter. Same trader, he said quietly. I saw him pass through heading your direction. Same wagon. He'd offloaded most of the hides to Rutherford, but he still had some. The room went very still. Not an accident. Not bad timing. Not the hard reality of frontier life. Gabe placed both hands flat on the counter and breathed through his nose once slowly, and made a decision about what kind of man he was going to be in the next few minutes. He was going to be the kind of man who finished gathering information before he let himself feel what this information meant. "Who was the traitor?" he asked. "Drifter. Don't know his name. But he had a brand mark on his wagon, a double-bar cross. Not common." "Any idea where he went after?" Walt shook his head. "Drifters drift." Gabe stood up straight. "Walt, if I needed a witness to what you just told me, someone willing to put their name to it in a legal proceeding." "Don't finish that sentence in here," Walt said, glancing at the door. "Then lower. Come back after dark. Bring paper." Gabe rode back to the ranch, with the information sitting in his chest, like a coal hot and heavy, and requiring careful handling. He did not let himself run through all the implications at once. He took them one at a time, in order the way you'd pick your way across loose ground, deliberately watching where each foot landed. Rutherford had bought contaminated hides. Rutherford had then sent the same trader to Gabe's ranch. Rutherford had started asking about Broken Ridge's financial situation 6 weeks before the cattle started dying. And Rutherford had shown up at the gate the day after the treatment began, looking at a man whose operation was supposedly failing, and had not been surprised by a single thing he heard. Eliza had known. She had known before Gabe had let himself know. He found her in the barn when he returned, crouched over the work table with 2 specimens laid out in front of her, comparing them with the magnifying lens she'd produced from somewhere inside that inexhaustible satchel. She didn't look up right away, but he knew from the set of her shoulders that she'd heard him come in. "You found something," she said. "So did you," he said, looking at the specimens. She straightened. "The tissue sample from the second steer. The pattern of cellular damage is consistent with a specific type of pathogen, one that doesn't occur naturally in Montana livestock. It's documented in a paper I read 2 years ago, an outbreak in Missouri. The pathogen was traced to imported hides from contaminated southern tanneries." She picked up the specimen container. "This was imported, Gabe. Someone brought this here. This doesn't come from the Bitterroot." He told her what Walt had told him. She listened without interrupting, which he had noticed was how she listened to everything completely without preparing her response while he was still talking. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So he bought the infected hides deliberately," she said. "He knew they were contaminated. Or he found out after and saw an opportunity. Either way, he sent them to you." "Either way." She set the specimen container down carefully. "Do you have any idea why he wants this land badly enough to do this?" Gabe had been asking himself that question for the last 2 hours on the road. The North Creek runs through the lower quarter of Broken Ridge before it crosses onto open range. It's the only reliable year-round water source in this section of the valley that isn't controlled by a major operation. He watched her face. "Whoever owns Broken Ridge controls that water." She looked at him. "Water rights?" "In a dry summer like this one," he said, "water rights in this valley are worth more than the land itself." The silence between them was a working silence, both of them moving pieces, seeing the shape of the thing that had been hidden under the surface of a dying herd and an ambitious neighbor's polite visits. "He expected you to fail," she said. "He expected the herd to die, the ranch to go under financially, and you to have no choice but to sell. And then a woman shows up with a veterinary kit and starts saving his plan." She almost laughed at that. Not the full thing, but the shape of it, brief and involuntary. Then she stopped herself and looked at the specimens again. "We need more than Walt's testimony," she said. "We need the contamination documented. We need the chain of evidence to hold from the southern tanneries to Rutherford's purchase to the trader to your ranch." She tapped the specimen container. "This is the physical proof. What Walt can provide is the narrative. But we need something that ties Rutherford directly, a bill of sale. A ledger entry, something with his name on a transaction for those hides. His foreman," Gabe said slowly. "Name's Cleet Harding. He and Rutherford have had a difficult year. I heard from the blacksmith that Rutherford shorted his wages over a dispute about lost stock. Cleet's the kind of man who nurses a grudge carefully." She looked at him. Do you know where to find him? Saturday evenings he drinks at the Harlan's Creek Saloon, alone because Rutherford's other men don't trust him. Today is Saturday, she said. He nodded. She picked up her notebook. Then here's what we do. You go back to town tonight to see Walt get his statement on paper. While you're there, see if Cleet Harding is at the saloon. Don't approach him directly, just establish contact. Let him see your face. If he's nursing a grievance against Rutherford, he'll come to you. Men like that always do. She looked up. And I stay here and finish the documentation on the specimens so that when this comes to a legal challenge, we have a case that doesn't depend on one man's word. He looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before. Done what? Built a case, he said. Against someone with more power than you. She held his gaze. I have had to prove things that people didn't want to believe, she said carefully, more times than I can count. You learn how to build an argument that can't be dismantled. She paused. Yes, I've done this before. He put on his hat. Keep the rifle close. It hasn't left my side since those riders came past the fence, she said. He was almost to the barn door when she spoke again. Gabe. He stopped. Those men who rode past last night, they might come back. I know. If Rutherford realizes we're building a case, not just treating the herd, but documenting the cause, he won't wait. He turned to look at her. She was standing at the work table with the specimens in front of her and the notebook in her hand, and the rifle leaning against the bench within arm's reach, and her expression was not afraid. It was serious in the way of someone who had already calculated the risk and decided it was worth taking. How long do you need to finish the documentation? He asked. Tonight. I can finish tonight. Then tonight we get what we need, he said. And tomorrow we make sure Rutherford knows he picked the wrong ranch. He rode out before she could respond. He didn't look back, but he heard her just before the distance swallowed the sound. A quiet, firm movement inside the barn. Something being set down with decision. Something being picked up with purpose. She was already working. Harlan's Creek at night was a different animal than Harlan's Creek in the daylight. The respectable people retreated behind closed doors, and what remained on the main street was the working version of a frontier town, rougher, louder, more honest in its way. Gabe tied his horse at the far end of the street and walked to the telegraph office through the back route. Walt had the statement already drafted. The man had not wasted the afternoon. The document was specific dated and signed, and it named the trader, described the wagon, and confirmed the timeline of Rutherford's inquiries about Broken Ridge. It was the kind of statement a judge could not easily dismiss. Gabe folded it, put it inside his jacket, and shook Walt's hand. You understand what this might mean, Gabe said. If this goes to court, I understand what it means if it doesn't go to court, Walt said. I've watched Rutherford operate in this valley for 8 years. He's taken water from 3 families by legal manipulation and run 2 ranchers off their land by economic pressure. He looked Gabe in the eye. I'm not afraid of him. I'm tired of him. Gabe left the telegraph office and stood in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust and letting his instincts run. Then he walked toward the saloon. He saw Cleet Harding at the far end of the bar before he was 2 steps inside the door. A big, weathered man with a permanent frown and the look of someone who had been calculating an injustice for a long time and hadn't yet found the right place to put it. He was drinking alone as predicted. Gabe ordered a whiskey at the opposite end of the bar and made no move toward Harding. He was patient by nature and by training, and he understood that the right approach to a man nursing a grievance was no approach at all. You let the man come to you. He was on his second drink when he heard the bar stool scrape. Harding set his glass down next to Gabe's and leaned on the bar without looking at him. You're the one who told Rutherford to get off your property yesterday, he said. My wife told him, Gabe said. A pause. Harding almost smiled. I heard. He turned the glass in his hands. You're in a bad spot, Callahan. Getting better, Gabe said. Another pause, longer this time. You know he was asking around about your water rights. Has been since spring. Harding's voice was low, barely above the noise of the room. "I know because I was there when he told his lawyer to start drawing up papers. Told him to be ready to move fast when the time came." He looked at his glass. The time was supposed to be about now, when the herd was gone and you didn't have the capital to stay. "Supposed to be," Gabe said. Something changed his schedule. Harding looked at him sideways. "Whatever your wife is doing in that barn." Gabe set his glass down. "What would it take," he said quietly, "for you to put what you just told me on paper?" Harding was quiet for a long time. "Rutherford owes me 4 months of wages," he said at last. "And he's got a signed note in his office desk. I witnessed the signing that proves he knew the condition of those hides before he arranged for the trader to bring them to your ranch." The bar noise continued around them. Neither man moved. "He has a note," Gabe said. "In his desk, left side drawer. He's riding to Helena Monday morning to see his lawyer. He'll take it with him." Harding looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't have access to that office after today." Gabe understood what was being said, and what was not being said, and what would be required. "I'll need that note," he said. Harding reached into his jacket and placed something on the bar between them. A key. Small brass worn smooth. "Office is empty until Sunday noon," Harding said. "After that I can't say." He picked up his glass, finished his drink, and stood. "I never had this conversation." He walked out of the saloon without looking back. Gabe sat with the key in his palm, and the weight of what the next 18 hours would require pressing down on him from every direction. He had Walt's statement. He had Eliza's specimens. He had Harding's testimony forming in the shape of a signed note in a locked drawer on a property that did not belong to him. He rode back to Broken Ridge fast and did not slow down until he saw the light in the barn window steady, unchanged, the light of someone still working. He went straight to the barn. Eliza looked up when he came through the door. She took one look at his face and put down her pen. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. She listened the same way she always listened, completely without interruption, and when he finished, she sat with it for exactly 4 seconds and then said, "We need to go tonight." "Rutherford's property," he said. "That's trespassing." "We need that note," she said. "If we're caught. If we don't get it, he destroys it Monday morning, and everything else we have becomes circumstantial." She looked at him steadily. "The specimens prove contamination. Walt proves the traitor. Harding's testimony supports motive. But a signed note in Rutherford's own hand, that's the end of the argument. That's the thing a judge cannot explain away." He looked at the key in his hand. She was already reaching for her jacket. "Eliza," he said. She stopped. "This is dangerous," he said. "You know that." "Yes," she said, without drama, without performance. Just yes. Like danger was a coordinate on a map she'd already plotted. "And saving your ranch is worth the danger. Which means we go." He looked at her for one more moment, this woman who had arrived 2 days ago with a satchel and a rifle and a diagnosis, and apparently no limit to the things she was willing to do for a situation she had decided was worth fighting for. He put the key in his pocket. "Stay close," he said, "and keep that rifle where you can reach it." "It's already in my hand," she said, and it was. They rode without lanterns. Gabe knew the terrain well enough to navigate by starlight, and Eliza rode close behind him without being asked, matching his pace, reading his signals the way a person reads weather, watching the set of his shoulders, the angle of his horse, the small adjustments that told her when to slow and when to hold. She did not speak. He appreciated that more than he could have said. Rutherford's northern boundary was marked by a split-rail fence that had been repaired recently. New wood pale against the dark, the smell of fresh-cut pine still faintly in the air. Gabe found the gap he remembered from a boundary dispute 3 years back, a section where the fence dipped into a dry wash and left enough clearance to pass through without dismounting. He went through first and waited. Eliza followed without hesitation. The main house was dark. The bunkhouse showed a single light in one window, which meant the hands were in for the night, and at least one of them was still awake. Gabe had counted on this. He had also counted on the layout of the property, which he knew from the one time Rutherford had invited him to a meeting of the Valley Ranchers. A meeting that had turned out to be a thinly veiled attempt to form a water use agreement that would have disadvantaged every small operation in the room. Gabe had left early. He had noted the office window on his way out. He tied the horses in the stand of cottonwoods behind the equipment shed out of sight of both the bunkhouse and the main house. Eliza tied hers alongside and unslung the Remington from her shoulder. She checked it without being told. He did not tell her to stay with the horses. They moved toward the house together. The office was on the ground floor, east side, accessible through a window that Harding's key would not help with, but the key was for the desk, not the building, and the window latch on Rutherford's office was the same simple iron hardware that every ranch house in Montana used, because nobody in this territory had ever thought they needed more than that. Gabe had the latch open in under a minute, the kind of skill acquired not through criminal enterprise, but through a lifetime of fixing things that were never designed well in the first place. He went in first. Eliza came through behind him and pulled the window to not latched, just resting, ready to move fast if fast became necessary. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and paper and the particular closed-up warmth of a room that belonged to a man who spent a lot of time in it. Gabe did not light a lamp. He moved to the desk by touch and memory and the thin starlight coming through the window glass, and he found the left side drawer and put Harding's key in it and felt the lock turn. The drawer was organized. Rutherford was a man who organized his corruption, apparently, which made the finding easier. There were ledger pages, correspondence, survey documents. Gabe's hands moved through them carefully, not disturbing the order reading by feel and the occasional careful angle toward the window light. Eliza crouched beside him and held a folded piece of oilcloth open, not a lantern but a reflector angled to catch the starlight and direct it downward. He had not known she'd brought it. He had not asked. He was beginning to understand that asking Eliza what she'd brought was like asking the river what direction it was going. The answer was always forward and always further than you expected. He found it in the third group of papers. A single folded sheet, heavy stock with a merchant's letterhead from a tannery in Shreveport, Louisiana. The letter confirmed the sale of a consignment of hides, listed the condition of the materials, and here Gabe read it twice, slowly, making sure described the hides as rejected inventory, contaminated with a bacterial agent, unsuitable for use with livestock, and noted that the purchaser had been informed of this condition at the time of sale. The purchaser's name was Josiah Rutherford. Below that, in Rutherford's own handwriting, a notation, a date, an instruction to the trader initials only, but Harding would know the name regarding delivery to a secondary location, and a figure, a payment, for services rendered. He had known this was what they were looking for. He had believed it was here. But holding the paper in his hands in the dark of a man's office, reading the proof of a deliberate act against everything Gabe had built and bled for it, was a different thing than believing. It hit him somewhere below the ribs, hard and specific, and he held very still for a moment and let it settle. Eliza's hand closed over his wrist. Not to stop him. Just present, steady. He folded the document carefully and put it inside his jacket. They were back out the window in 3 minutes. Back to the horses in 5. Moving through the gap in the fence and onto open land in 8. Neither of them spoke until they were well clear of Rutherford's boundary. Then Eliza said quietly, "You found it." "I found it," he said. A pause. "Is it enough? Combined with Walt's statement and your specimens and Harding's testimony?" He steadied his horse on the dark road. "Yes, it's enough." She didn't respond immediately. He heard her exhale a long, controlled breath, the kind that comes after sustained tension releases. Just the one. Then she was composed again. "We need to get it to the county sheriff before Rutherford knows it's gone," she said. "First light," he said. "We ride to the county seat." "Together," she said. It was not a question. "Together," he said. They reached Broken Ridge after midnight. The ranch was quiet. The treated animals settled the barn, holding the stillness of a place that had been worried over and worked on, and was for the moment resting. Gabe checked the sick pen before he did anything else, old habit, the kind that didn't require deciding. 4 of the 6 animals they'd treated that morning were standing. 2 were still down but restless, which was an improvement over motionless. He stood at the fence for a moment. Eliza came to stand beside him. She looked at the animals and made a small sound, not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but adjacent to both. 4 standing, he said. By morning, it might be 5, she said. He turned to look at her. In the dark, with the starlight on her face and the rifle at her side, and 3 days of hard work visible in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, she looked like exactly what she was. A person who had come to a difficult place and decided it was worth fighting for, and had not once flinched from that decision. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Plain and direct, the way he said everything that mattered. She held his gaze. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We still have to get through tomorrow." But her voice had something in it, a warmth carefully contained like a fire banked for the night. There, but not shown. Not yet. He nodded and went inside. He did not sleep much. He lay in the dark and thought through the morning, the road to the county seat, the presentation of the evidence, the legal process that would follow the inevitable moment when Rutherford was confronted with what they had. He thought about the things that could go wrong. He thought about the things that had already gone right, which was a practice he had never been good at, but was tonight attempting. At 4 a.m, he heard her moving in the kitchen. He got up. She was at the table with her notebook writing in the thin lamplight, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had not seen before. She always had it pinned when she was working, and the looseness of it made her look younger, less defended, more like a person and less like a position. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway and did not seem surprised. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "I'm writing up the full clinical documentation," she said. "Everything: specimen analysis, symptom, progression, treatment, protocol, diagnosis, rationale. If this goes to court, I want a complete scientific record that can be reviewed by any veterinarian in the territory." She turned a page. "I also wrote a summary of the contamination evidence as I understand it from what you found in the office and what Walt told you, in case my testimony is needed." He sat down across from her. "You'd testify?" "Of course," she said, like it was the most straightforward thing in the world, which to her apparently it was. He looked at her for a moment. "You've been building this case since the first day," he said. "The samples, the documentation, the way you questioned Rutherford's reaction at the gate." She put down her pen. "I've been building the case since I got on the stagecoach," she said quietly. "Not against Rutherford specifically, I didn't know about him, but against the possibility that what you described in your letter was not natural." She looked at the notebook. "A healthy herd doesn't collapse like this without a cause, and causes have sources. I've learned not to assume the source is innocent until I've ruled out that it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard way to see the world." "It's an accurate way," she said. "There's a difference." He almost said something then, something that was forming in the back of his mind, and had been forming since the evening of the first day when he had stood at the fence watching a dying ranch find a reason to hold on. He didn't say it. It wasn't time yet. There was still too much unfinished between them, and the day ahead was going to require everything they had. But he let himself feel it quietly, privately, in the way of a man who had spent too many years not letting himself feel much of anything. It was a tentative thing, but it was real. "Try to sleep a few hours," he said. "I'll take the early watch." She nodded and closed the notebook. But she didn't move right away. She sat with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular, and he recognized the look. It was the same one he wore when something was sitting in his chest that he hadn't decided what to do with yet. "I didn't expect this," she said finally, not looking at him. "When I answered the advertisement, I expected hard work and hard country and a man who needed practical help and would give me room to provide it." A pause. "I didn't expect to find a situation that mattered this much." He understood that she was not talking only about the cattle. He didn't say anything because saying something would have required naming what was between them, and they were not ready for that. Not tonight, not with the evidence in his jacket and the county seat 40 miles away, and Rutherford still operating under the assumption that his plan was on schedule. But he held her gaze for a long moment, and he let her see that he had heard her. That was enough. For now. She went to her room. He went to the window. Dawn broke hard and fast the way it always did in the Montana summer. No soft edges, just dark, and then light, and then the sun climbing like it had somewhere urgent to be. Gabe had the horses ready before Eliza appeared on the porch, documentation, in hand, satchel over her shoulder rifle in its saddle scabbard. She had pinned her hair back up. She was all business again, the warmth of the pre-dawn kitchen conversation packed away where it wouldn't interfere with what the day required. He handed her the reins without comment. They rode hard. The county seat was Millard Junction, a real town by Montana standards, a courthouse, a proper sheriff's office, a land registry, and a federal postal station. They arrived before 10. Gabe went directly to the sheriff's office, and Eliza went with him, and neither of them waited to be invited. Sheriff Cal Denny was a deliberate man, heavy-set with the measured patience of someone who had seen most varieties of human behavior, and had learned not to react to any of them before he had all the information. He listened to Gabe without interrupting. He examined the document from Rutherford's desk, with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. He read Walt Briggs' signed statement twice. He asked Eliza 3 specific questions about the specimen documentation, and her answers were precise and complete, and he wrote down parts of them. When they were done, he sat back and looked at both of them. "This is a serious allegation," he said. "It's a documented one," Eliza said. "I'm aware of that, Miss Miller." He looked at the papers again. "You understand that the document obtained from Rutherford's desk was obtained with a key provided by a current employee with authorized access to the property," Eliza said without blinking. "And the desk drawer was not forced. We will provide Mr. Harding's name and location." Denny looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked at Gabe. "She always this prepared?" "Every time," Gabe said. Denny stood up. "I'll need to verify the chain of evidence before I can move on Rutherford. That will take until this afternoon at the earliest." He looked at Gabe. "You need to go back to the ranch. If Rutherford finds out you've been here before, I can get a man out to his property. He'll move to destroy whatever else he's got." He paused. "How confident are you in your herd's condition?" "The treatment is working," Eliza said. "We have animals improving, but the remaining untreated herd is still at risk if the source contamination isn't contained." "I'll have a deputy ride to your ranch by noon," Denny said. "In the meantime," he looked at both of them, "watch your fence line." They were back on the road within 20 minutes. Halfway home, Gabe heard the shot. It was distant far enough that it might have been a hunter, might have been someone clearing a field. But the direction was wrong. It came from the east, which was the direction of his ranch, and it was a single crack that did not repeat, which was not the pattern of target shooting or pest control. He looked at Eliza. She had already turned her horse. They rode hard. They came over the last rise above the ranch road and saw them. Before they were seen, 3 horses at the gate, 2 men on foot, and a third man still mounted. One of the men on foot was at the barn door. The other had positioned himself between the house and the sick pen. Rutherford was the man still mounted. He had not waited for Monday. Gabe pulled his horse to a stop at the ridge crest and made himself think for 4 seconds before he moved. 4 seconds. He counted them. Eliza was beside him, rifle already out of the scabbard, watching the scene below with her jaw set and her eyes moving from the barn to the pen to the man on the horse. "He came for the vat," she said quietly, "and the specimens." "The specimens are in your satchel," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I go in the front," he said. "You go around the east side through the cottonwoods. You come up behind the man at the pen. Don't fire unless—" "I know when to fire," she said. He believed her. He rode down the main road straight and fast and without stealth, because stealth was not the point. The point was that Rutherford needed to see him coming and needed to know that he had been seen and needed to make a decision about what kind of man he was going to be right now in this moment with everything visible. Rutherford turned his horse at the sound of hooves, and his expression cycled through three things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and the particular smoothing of a man who has decided to front his way through a situation he did not expect. "Callahan," he said with the practiced ease of a man who had never in his life been caught doing something he couldn't explain. "I was hoping to catch you here. I had concerns about the situation with your animals and wanted to check." "Get off my property," Gabe said. He had stopped his horse 10 feet from Rutherford's, and he sat very straight, and his voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Now, Callahan, I understand you're under pressure. I found your note, Rutherford." Gabe watched the man's face. "The one from the Shreveport tannery. The one with your name on a purchase order for contaminated hides. The one with the instruction to your man about delivery to a secondary location." He kept his eyes level. "I found it last night. It's in Millard Junction right now, sitting on Sheriff Denny's desk." The smooth expression cracked. It was a small crack. He was a man of practice and control, but it was visible, and it was real, and Gabe saw it and let the silence hold it. "That document was obtained illegally," Rutherford said, and his voice had gone from smooth to something harder and thinner. "Obtained with a key from an authorized employee," Gabe said, "which your lawyer will explain to you shortly doesn't constitute breaking and entering." A beat. "Your foreman sends his regards." From the direction of the sick pen, Gabe heard a sound, a sharp command, a scuffle, and then Eliza's voice, clear and completely unafraid. "Put it down. Put it down right now, or I will put you down. Your choice, and you have 3 seconds to make it." A pause. Then the sound of something dropped in the dirt. Rutherford's jaw tightened. The man at the barn door looked toward the sick pen, then at Gabe, then at Rutherford, and the calculation on his face was the calculation of a man deciding whether what he was being paid was worth what he was currently standing in. "Walk away," Gabe said to him quietly. "This is not your fight, and you know it." The man at the barn door looked at Rutherford one more time. Rutherford said nothing. The man walked to his horse and rode out without looking back. That left Rutherford alone on his horse, with nothing between him and the accounting he had spent months engineering around. "You built this whole thing," Gabe said. "The hides, the trader, the questions about my mortgage, the plan to buy the water rights when I went under." He was not yelling. Yelling was for men who needed volume to feel powerful. Gabe Callahan had never needed volume. "You were going to take my ranch apart piece by piece and make it look like bad luck and bad timing." Rutherford said nothing. His face had gone very still. "And it almost worked," Gabe said. "Except you didn't account for the one thing that changed." He didn't look toward the east side of the property, toward where Eliza had gone. He didn't need to. He could feel her presence the way you feel a fixed point in uncertain terrain, steady, reliable, the thing you navigate by. "She came," he said simply. He heard hoofbeats from the main road. 2 riders moving fast with the deliberate pace of men who knew where they were going and had authority to go there. Deputies' horses he'd ridden behind deputies enough times to know the sound. Rutherford heard it too. He sat very straight on his horse, and for just a moment, with the deputies coming up the road, and Gabe in front of him, and whatever was happening on the east side of the property, firmly out of his control. Josiah Rutherford looked like exactly what he was, a man who had mistaken wealth for permanence and power for righteousness, and was now meeting the place where that mistake ended. "I want my lawyer," he said. "You'll get him," Gabe said. "After." The deputies rode through the gate. Eliza appeared from the east side of the property, rifle in hand. The man from the pen, walking 6 feet ahead of her with his hands where they were visible, and his pride in ruins. She brought him to the gate with the same plain efficiency she brought to everything, and handed him to the deputy without drama or ceremony. Then she walked to where Gabe sat on his horse and stood beside him and looked at Rutherford, and whatever she felt about the man who had tried to ruin the ranch she had arrived to save, she kept it in her face rather than her voice. "You should have asked your questions at the gate," she said. "I gave you the chance. Rutherford looked at her with the full weight of his contempt and his defeat combined, and Eliza held that look the way she held everything straight and steady and completely unimpressed. One of the deputies dismounted and spoke to Rutherford in the clipped language of legal procedure, and Rutherford dismounted and put his wrists where they were required and said nothing more. He was taken. Not dramatically, there was no theater in it. Just a man being held accountable on a Tuesday morning in the Montana summer on a ranch he had tried to destroy, and failed to with the evidence against him folded in the breast pocket of the man whose cattle he had poisoned, and whose water he had wanted, and whose resilience he had catastrophically underestimated. Gabe watched until the deputies rode back toward the county road with Rutherford between them. Then the tension that had been coiled in him for 3 days, for 3 weeks if he was being honest, released all at once, and he sat on his horse and let it go without making a production of it, the way he did everything private. He heard Eliza exhale beside him. Long, controlled, real. He dismounted and she was already on the ground, and they stood 4 feet apart in the yard of Broken Ridge Ranch, with the morning sun high and the dust settling, and the sick pen behind them, holding animals that were still alive, because she had come when she had knowing what she knew, and had not stopped working for a single hour since. He looked at her, she looked back. 5 standing this morning, she said. You checked before we left, he said. I always check, she said. He took a breath. Eliza. I know, she said quietly. And then after a pause, me too. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew exactly what she meant, and for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, Gabe Callahan stood in the sun on his own land and felt something that was not worry or grief, or the grinding weight of a man fighting alone. He felt it simply and plainly, and let it be what it was. The ranch was not saved yet. There was the legal process ahead, and the herd still recovering, and the long work of a summer that had been cruel and would need to be rebuilt from. There was much still to do, and much still uncertain. But the worst was over, and he was not doing it alone. The day after Rutherford was taken, the ranch was very quiet. Not the quiet of absence, not the hollow silence that had lived in the house for years before Eliza arrived, but the quiet of aftermath. Of a storm past, of people and animals and land that had been through something hard, and were now slowly finding their level again. Gabe was at the sick pen before sunrise, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he stood there for a long time without moving, without cataloging or calculating or planning the next task. He just stood and looked at the animals. 7 of the original 8 treated cattle were on their feet. The 8th was down, but eating and eating, Eliza had told him the evening before, was the most important sign. An animal that eats is an animal that intends to live. He heard the back door open and her footsteps crossing the yard, and he did not turn around. She came to stand at the fence beside him. She looked at the same 7 standing animals and said nothing for a moment. Then, 8, she said. He turned. The animal that had been down was standing. Slow, unsteady head low but upright. He looked at her. Told you, she said quietly. Not triumphant. Just certain in the way she was certain about most things she had earned the right to be certain about. He turned back to the fence. He gripped the top rail with both hands, and he did not say anything, because there was too much to say, and none of it was ready yet. But she was standing close enough that their arms were nearly touching, and neither of them moved away, and that said enough for the moment. They treated the final 2 sick animals before breakfast. The work was easier now. The rhythm between them fully established, no instruction needed, each of them moving into position before the other had to indicate it. The animals were calmer too, as if they had learned through 3 days of this that the process led somewhere better than where they'd started. When it was done, Eliza recorded the final treatment notes in her book with the same precision she'd applied to the first entry 4 days ago. Gabe watched her write and thought about the distance between that first morning and this one, how much had changed, how fast it had moved, how different the ranch felt with another person's presence woven into the daily fabric of it. Sheriff Denny sent a rider last night, Gabe said while she was writing. She looked up. Rutherford is being held pending a formal hearing. The document from the tannery Walt's statement, Harding's testimony. Denny says it's sufficient to pursue criminal charges. Deliberate contamination of a neighbor's livestock. Conspiracy to defraud for purposes of property acquisition. He paused. Harding gave a full account, including the name of the traitor. Eliza set down her pen. Did they find him? He was still in the territory, 2 towns over, waiting to be paid for the second part of the job. He let that sit for a second. There was a second part. Her eyes went sharp. What second part? If the cattle treatment showed signs of working, if it looked like the herd was recovering, the trader was supposed to introduce a second contamination, to the water supply. He watched her face. Rutherford wasn't leaving it to chance. He had a contingency. She was very still. When the trader said he was waiting for word from Rutherford's man. The word never came because Rutherford was detained before he could send it. Gabe held her gaze. The ranch is safe, Eliza. The water is safe. But you need to know how close it came to being otherwise. She looked at the notebook in her hands. Then she set it on the fence rail and pressed both palms flat on the wood and breathed slow and deliberate, and he recognized that breath. It was the same one she'd used on the road home from the county seat when the tension released. She did not perform distress. She processed it and moved through it and came out the other side. The samples I kept, she said after a moment. The chain of evidence. If the water had been contaminated, we'd have had documentation of the original contamination pattern, he said. It would have strengthened the case, not weakened it. She almost laughed. It was a sharp, brief, exhausted sound. We would have had documentation of a catastrophe and called it an advantage. That's one way to survive, he said. She looked at him. The morning light was full on her face, and she looked tired in the clean way that comes from having spent everything you had on something that mattered. He thought she was the most honest-looking person he had ever stood next to. Your ranch is going to be all right, she said. Not a comfort statement, the kind she made about things she had assessed and concluded. Our ranch, he said. She went very still. He had not planned to say it. It had not been a calculated thing. It was simply what came out when a man had been trying not to say the truest thing for too long, and his defenses finally gave out. He watched her face and did not take it back. Gabe, she said carefully, I know we have not discussed what this is, he said. Between us. I know we have been busy with other things. I know you came here under specific circumstances that did not include... He stopped, tried again. I am not a man who speaks easily about what he feels. You have probably noticed that. I've noticed, she said. Then you'll understand that when I say something plainly, I mean it plainly. He turned to face her fully. I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Not because you've earned your place here, though you have more than I could have asked for. He held her gaze. Because I would like to continue learning what it means to work alongside someone who thinks the way you think and fights the way you fight. And because the house has been too quiet for too long, and since you arrived, it has not been quiet, and I find that I have already forgotten how I managed before. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that he began to prepare for something measured and careful. Something that acknowledged what he'd said without fully committing to it. What she said was, You should have led with that 4 days ago. He blinked. I beg your pardon. You heard me. The edge of a smile. Real this time. Not the almost version she'd been allowing through the cracks, the full thing, small and genuine and completely unguarded. 4 days ago, when I told you I wasn't here to be managed, you should have said then that you didn't want to manage me. It would have saved us considerable tension. It might have, he said, though I think the tension had its uses. She picked up her notebook and looked at it. I'll stay, she said. Simply, finally, the same way she did everything without excess. I'll stay because this ranch is worth staying for. And because... She closed the notebook. Because I find that I have already started thinking of the sick pen as my sick pen, and the barn as my barn, and I am not generally given to claiming things that don't belong to me." He said nothing. He did not need to. She turned and walked back toward the house, and he stood at the fence a moment longer, and the 8 cattle stood in the pen behind him, and the Montana summer pressed down with its usual merciless warmth, and Broken Ridge Ranch held its ground exactly the way it had always held its ground, stubbornly, imperfectly, and with no intention of giving up. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected, which was itself unusual in Montana, where the law tended to move at the pace of the terrain, deliberate and not easily hurried. But the case against Rutherford was, as Eliza had predicted, difficult to dismantle. The tannery letter, Walt's signed account, Harding's full testimony, which turned out to be more detailed and more damaging than even Harding had indicated at the saloon bar. He had kept records of his own dates and conversations and instructions he had witnessed and written down in a small ledger. He'd kept precisely because he had known for months that he was working for a man who would eventually need to be accounted for. 3 weeks after the arrest, Josiah Rutherford stood before a circuit judge in Millard Junction and did not find the proceeding going the way his lawyer had suggested it might. The evidence was physical, documented, witnessed, and corroborated. The conspiracy was clear. The intent was established by the contamination records and the timeline of his inquiries about the ranch's financial situation, and the payment to the trader, and the contingency plan for the water supply that he had apparently not thought necessary to keep secret from his foreman. Eliza testified. She had prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything thoroughly, specifically without drama. She had her clinical documentation organized in sequence. She had her specimen analysis written in language accessible to a non-specialist audience. She had anticipated every question the defense might raise about her qualifications. She was a woman, she was young. She did not hold a formal veterinary license in Montana, and she had prepared precise and unassailable answers to each. When the defense lawyer asked whether she was qualified to draw the conclusions her documentation contained, she had looked at him with the particular stillness she reserved for questions she found both predictable and inadequate, and she had said, "I apprenticed for 2 years under a practicing veterinarian, and spent an additional year working with a herd of 300 animals in Indiana. I identified a pathogen in this case that 3 local veterinarians had failed to diagnose in 3 weeks. I designed and implemented a treatment protocol that saved 11 of 12 animals that received it. If you'd like to challenge my qualifications, you're welcome to produce someone who would have done better." The judge had not sustained the defense's objection. Gabe, sitting 3 rows back, had pressed his thumbnail into his palm to keep his expression neutral. She had not looked at him when she said it. She had not needed to. Rutherford was convicted on 2 counts: criminal contamination of livestock, conspiracy to defraud. His lawyer argued for leniency on the grounds of his standing in the community and his economic contribution to the valley. The judge listened to this argument with visible patience and then sentenced Rutherford to 18 months and the forfeiture of any claim to the water rights at issue in the case, which were formally registered to Broken Ridge Ranch under Gabe Callahan's name before the month was out. Harding, for his testimony and cooperation, was given no charges, and the 4 months of back wages Rutherford had withheld recovered from the estate. Walt Briggs bought a new hat with the reward posted for information leading to the conviction. He wore it every day for the rest of that summer and into fall, and whenever anyone asked about it, he told the whole story from beginning to end with the relish of a man who had waited a long time to be on the right side of something. Eliza's paper arrived from the printer 6 weeks after the trial. It was 12 pages carefully organized, written in the precise and accessible style she had developed over 2 years of explaining complicated things to people who were skeptical of her before she opened her mouth. It documented the outbreak, the pathogen, the contamination mechanism, the treatment protocol, and the outcomes. It named the disease, accurately cited the relevant literature, and proposed a standardized response procedure for ranchers and territorial veterinarians who encountered similar presentations. She had sent it without telling Gabe to the Territorial Livestock Commission, to 3 practicing veterinarians she had corresponded with during her training, and to the agricultural editor of the Helena paper. The Helena paper ran it. Gabe found out about the paper when a writer came out from Harlan's Creek with 3 copies of the issue and a note from the editor asking if Miss Miller would be willing to contribute a regular column on livestock health for the territory's farming readership. He brought the paper inside and set it on the kitchen table in front of her, without a word. She looked at it. At her name in print above 12 pages of work that represented everything she had learned, and everything she had risked, and everything she had spent the last 2 years trying to be taken seriously enough to practice. She put her hand flat on the page. He sat down across from her and waited. "He wants a column," Gabe said. "I read the note," she said. "You should do it." She looked up. "I have a ranch to help run." "The ranch will be here," he said. "Your work needs to be out in the world." He held her gaze. "You know that." She looked back at the paper, at her name, at the 12 pages that had come out of a leather satchel, and a lifetime of not being believed, and 3 days of fighting for a ranch that was not hers by birth, but had become hers by choice, and by effort, and by the particular kind of love that grows between people who have been through something real together and come out the other side still standing. "I'll write the column," she said quietly, "on the condition that you stop pretending you don't read the livestock journals I leave on the kitchen table." He said nothing. "I've seen you," she said. "Twice." "I was looking for something else," he said. "You were reading the article on winter pasture rotation," she said. "I had a bookmark in it." He picked up his coffee cup. "The coffee's going cold." She smiled at the paper. Full and unguarded, the same as the morning at the fence, and something in his chest turned over quietly, the way things turn when they settle into their right place after a long time of being unsettled. The column ran monthly. The letters came weekly. Ranchers from as far as the Dakota Territory wrote to ask about the treatment protocol. 2 veterinarians wrote requesting copies of the full specimen analysis. A woman in Wyoming wrote to say that she had read the paper and had been struggling to have her own observations about her husband's herd taken seriously, and that reading work published under another woman's name had made her feel that her knowledge was not as worthless as she had been told it was. That letter was the one Eliza read 3 times. That was the one she kept in the front of her notebook, folded carefully, carried with her the way you carry something you reach for when the hard days come. The herd recovered fully by the end of summer. All 12 treated animals survived. The remaining healthy herd, protected by the precautionary treatment Eliza had insisted on from the start, showed no further symptoms. By September, Broken Ridge had the strongest cattle numbers it had carried in 4 years, the water rights to the North Creek formally secured, and a reputation in the valley that had shifted not overnight, but unmistakably from a ranch that nearly failed to a ranch that refused to. People came to Gabe now the way they had not before. Not with sympathy or the careful neutrality of neighbors watching a man fail, but with the different quality of attention that communities give to people who have demonstrated that they are serious about lasting. The feed merchant extended a line of credit without being asked. The blacksmith sent his son out to help with the fall fence repairs. 3 of the valley ranchers who had sat in Rutherford's manipulative meeting 4 years ago stopped by at different times on different pretexts, and all of them found reasons to talk to Eliza before they left. She handled these conversations with the same practical directness she handled everything. She answered questions, gave opinions when asked, declined to give them when not, and sent people away with the information they had come for, and sometimes with the information they had needed but not thought to ask for. Gabe watched this from a careful distance and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The particular satisfaction of seeing 2 things fit together that were built to fit, but had needed time and pressure and the right circumstances to find their alignment. One evening in late September, the air finally carrying the first edge of autumn, they sat on the porch after supper, and she read from the latest letter she'd received a veterinarian in Colorado, this time wanting to know about the specimen preservation method she had used. And he listened and thought about the morning he had stood at a fence with a dying herd and no answers, and had written a letter to a stranger in desperation, and had not known, could not have known, what that letter would set in motion. "You're thinking about something?" she said without looking up from the letter. "How do you know that? You get quiet in a particular way when you're thinking versus when you're just being quiet." She turned the page. The thinking quiet has a different texture. He considered this. You've been here 4 months. Long enough to learn the texture of your silences, she said simply. He looked out at the pasture. The cattle were grazing in the evening light, unhurried, the healthy and ordinary motion of animals that had been through something hard and had come through it. The fences were sound. The barn was solid. The water ran clean in the North Creek, uncontested, belonging now by law to the land it had always belonged to by nature. I was thinking, he said, about the letter I wrote. She put down the correspondence and looked at him. I wrote it in desperation, he said. I wrote it because I was out of options and too stubborn to admit I couldn't solve the problem alone. I kept the language plain because I didn't want to promise anyone something I couldn't deliver. He paused. I have never been more grateful for a piece of honest writing in my life. She was quiet for a moment. What made you think honest writing was the right approach? My father told me once. He said that if you want to find a person worth keeping, tell them the truth about what you are and let them decide. Don't dress the thing up. Don't make it better than it is. Just tell the truth. He turned to look at her. He was right about most things. She looked at him steadily. He sounds like a man worth listening to. He was, Gabe said. Gabe. She picked up the letter again, but she was not reading it. He could tell because her eyes were not moving. She was holding it the way you hold something when you need your hands occupied while your mind does work elsewhere. My veterinarian told me something similar, she said after a while, when I first asked him to teach me. He said a practitioner who overstates what she knows will kill more animals than she saves. Know what you know. Know what you don't. Say both plainly. She turned the letter in her hands. I think that's the same advice for different work. I think it is, he said. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the cattle called out a low, easy sound. Nothing urgent, just a voice in the evening that meant everything was as it should be. Gabe listened to it the way he had listened to those sounds all his life. The language of a herd that was calm and safe and present, and for the first time in a very long time, the sound did not carry the shadow of everything he was afraid of losing. He reached across and took her hand. He did not make a production of it. He just did it the way you do something that has been true for a while and has simply been waiting for the moment to be named. She turned her hand and held his back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the holding did not already say more plainly. The autumn settled around Broken Ridge Ranch, the way it always did in the Bitterroot. Slow and golden and deliberate, the mountains going sharp against a sky that had never been anything but enormous. The work of the season was ahead of them, the preparations that a Montana ranch required before the cold came, the 100 things that needed doing and would be done the way all things on that land had always been done, with effort and intention and without complaint. Eliza's column ran in the Helena paper on the 1st of every month. The letters kept coming. The column was picked up by spring by 2 additional territorial papers, and her name became something that people in the livestock community recognized before they had ever met her. A name that meant solid information, practical method, and a refusal to say more than she knew or less than she believed. She was 25 years old, and she had built that from nothing and from scratch and from a stubbornness that looked from the outside exactly like confidence. Because by the time you have done a thing enough times to do it well, the difference between the two stops mattering. Gabe repaired the north fence that fall, all of it, every post, every rail, and when he finished the last section, he stood back and looked at the whole line running clean and true from the ridge to the creek, and he felt the satisfaction of a completed thing. Eliza had come out to watch him finish the last post. She stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, the notebook under her arm that was never entirely absent, and she looked at the fence with the same assessment she brought to everything. Straight, she said. It is, he said. The third post from the east end leaned slightly. He looked. She was right, barely a degree or two, nothing that would affect the function. Does it bother you? She considered this seriously. No, she said, because everything else is straight. She looked at him. One imperfect post in a line of sound ones is not a failure. It's evidence that the work was done by a human being and not a machine." He looked at her. "That might be the kindest thing you've said to me." "Don't flatter yourself," she said. "I was talking about the fence." But she was smiling when she said it, full and real and unguarded. And he was smiling back, which was not something he had done easily or often in the years before she had stepped off a stagecoach with a leather satchel and a rifle and a diagnosis he hadn't asked for and a willingness to fight for something she barely knew yet. What Gabe Callahan had ordered was practical help for a dying ranch. What arrived was the woman who saved it, and then stayed and built something from the saving that was larger and stronger and more lasting